Okay, guys. Hi, good evening, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started today. So again, for those of you who have just recently joined, I have a sign up sheet going on in the chat for you to go ahead and log in for attendance. So for those of you who do not know me or might not be familiar, I'm Jackie Fleury and the current president-elect of AMCP. I just want to welcome you back for what is our third and final installment of our three-part P&T seminar series. Today, we are privileged to have with us Dr. Daniel Simmons. Just for a brief introduction, he's an associate director. He works with economics and research outcomes at AstraZeneca. He'll be providing an introduction today into pharmacoeconomics for us. So providing cost-effective medication therapy is a really big role of a P&T committee. On this, information you learn today will really help us to build a strong foundation for us to build financial models within the competition for our teams. And so we're going to go ahead and start our presentation. We'll follow it up with a Q&A. So without further ado, please help me to welcome Dr. Daniel Simmons.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to speak with all of you. Let me share my screen. Okay. And can you all see that?
Yeah, we can see it.
Yeah. Perfect. And thank you very much for that introduction. So my name is Dan Simmons. I am an associate director of health economics and outcomes research at AstraZeneca. And I work primarily in our oncology space, mainly on gynecologic oncology products for ovarian, cervical, and endometrial cancers. So just want to preface this by saying this was not sponsored or promoted by AstraZeneca. Keep the lawyers happy. I'm doing this all on my own. With that being said, let me give you a quick overview of what I plan to talk about tonight. So I'm really excited to be here. It wasn't too long ago when I was doing a P&T competition in pharmacy school. And I remember how exciting it was to start off with P&T, but also at the same time kind of daunting. There's quite a bit of different things you need to know and learn and a lot of new terminology. So I want to make that as simple as possible. So I'm going to start off with a quick introduction to what I do in my current role and how I got there. Since I know a lot of you are in, or all of you are in pharmacy school, I wanted to share kind of my non-traditional career path and how I got to that. And I think I really liked that when I was in pharmacy school, being able to see people's kind of direction and kind of the roller coaster it takes to get to your future career. So once we've done that, I want to talk about why should we even care about healthcare costs? Why is this so important, and why is what the P&T does critical to the larger healthcare system in general? And I want to talk about kind of a theoretical definition. What even is value in healthcare? And if you understand what value is in healthcare, I think you can make a really good P&T competition decision. Then I'm going to touch on probably two of the most important economic modeling types that you may encounter during your review of a product: cost effectiveness models and budget impact models. And these are probably going to be the two you'll see the most when working on the P&T competition. And then I'll touch a little bit on how payers actually use this data to make decisions. What kind of tools do they have to manage their formulary? Because at the end of the P&T, you'll need to make a recommendation. So starting off, how did I get to my current role, and what exactly do I do in my role? So I went to pharmacy school at Rutgers in New Jersey, and I went into pharmacy school kind of by accident. So Rutgers in New Jersey has a 6-year PharmD program, so you apply right out of high school. So I knew I wanted a career in the pharmaceutical industry before I knew I wanted to go into pharmacy. So being from New Jersey, I kind of grew up around the science and the pharmaceutical industry and absolutely loved science. So I was looking at different careers, and I almost went to biomedical engineering. So I was applying to different career paths, and Rutgers' application had 3 lines on the application. So I put my first choice, engineering, my second choice, business, my third choice, I said, I can't leave it blank. That would look bad on the application. So my mom's a pharmacist, so I decided to write pharmacy on my application. Never expecting to get accepted. I didn't think my grades were good enough or whatnot, But I got accepted to pharmacy school, and then I seriously started considering it as a career option. And I talked to some people in the pharmaceutical industry, and they all said, if you're interested in doing research and going this direction, go to pharmacy school. It's a great career path, and there's a lot of different options. So I went to pharmacy school, and because we were a 6-year program, the first 2 years were kind of pre-professional classes. So one of the classes we had to take was microeconomics, and I absolutely fell in love with economics to the point where I thought about switching out of pharmacy and going to become an economist. And my professor said, well, have you heard of health economics? You can marry the two things you like, science and pharmacy and economics. I said, sold. That's what I want to do with my life. So I started looking for ways to explore that. So I joined a club we had at Rutgers. I'm not sure if your school has it, but International Society for Pharmacoeconomics and Outcomes Research, very similar to AMCP, but an international kind of group of students who's really interested in this kind of research. It was a small club, so I got really involved with that through pharmacy school. And I took a job at Walgreens where I worked for 5 years during the summers. Have to pay for school and all of that. And working at Walgreens, I really got to see a lot of the challenges with the US healthcare system. And the two things that really stood out to me were the fact that a lot of our decisions weren't evidence-based, and there was a lot of economic inefficiency and issues around access to treatments. So I started reaching out to professors, and I got involved in research. And I did some research with a health center in inner city Trenton, New Jersey, looking at, can we use pharmacist interventions to improve diabetes outcomes? And I absolutely loved working on that research. And the professor I was doing the research with had previously worked in the pharmaceutical industry. So she called up someone she knew at J&J, and I had the opportunity to do an internship with J&J in their health economics and outcomes research department. And it was one of the best summers of my life. Absolutely loved what I was working on and didn't want to go home at the end of the day. So I went back to J&J the next summer and worked on some more research. And then when I was picking rotations, my boss at J&J recommended that I try to see the full perspective of health economics. So I did a rotation with Blue Cross Blue Shield of New Jersey to see the payer side and actually see the formulary decision-making process, how claims are processed and all of that. And then I went to work for a health economics consulting firm on one of my rotations. And then lastly, I went and worked on Wall Street in venture capital, doing investments in new biotech companies. So all of those experiences made me realize this is the field. After doing all of this, I realized I still love this. So I applied to the fellowship programs in the pharmaceutical industry, and I had the opportunity to do a 2-year postdoc with AstraZeneca. So the program was great. It allowed me to get a master's degree while working. And it was absolutely fantastic experience. I got a master's degree in health outcomes policy and economics while working. And then after my fellowship ended, AstraZeneca kept me on full time, and now going on 3-4 years, and time has really flown. So in my current role, I'm part of this larger organization called Global Medical Affairs, Medical Evidence, and External Alliances, which is a fancy title that really doesn't tell you what we do. But the idea is, I'm going to touch on it on the next slide, clinical trials don't have all the evidence in the world. And a clinical trial tells you, will a drug work under ideal circumstances? But there's a lot of other things that we need to consider and other research that needs to be done to support a pharmaceutical product. So we have a really great organization that helps with that. So our strategy team figures out what are some of the questions that weren't answered by the trials and where we need more evidence. And then once they've determined what questions there are, it comes to my group, real world evidence science. And under that, if it's kind of a US challenge, I would conduct a study. If it's a kind of global challenge or an international problem, the global epidemiology team would do a study. And we have a group of incredible data scientists and programmers. And then we have other teams that help support us, like evidence delivery and publications, and groups that go out and make big connections with big cancer centers. So it's a really great organization that all works towards generating evidence. So what kind of evidence do we generate? So the way I see it is we are a bridge. And I love this slide. I love the sharks in the bridge, but I think it really summarizes kind of what we do. There's a huge gap between a drug being approved and patients actually getting access to it and using it. So we need to generate a lot of the evidence that the P&T committees use to make their formulary decisions and get patients access to it through the payer. And there's a lot of questions. Cost is the biggest one. What's this drug going to cost the payer? So my team does economic research to help answer these questions that payers have. And we answer the questions of physicians, making them comfortable. How does this drug work in the real world, real patients? How does it work in comparison to our competitors that weren't in the clinical trial? What's the safety profile look like? We're all pharmacists, and safety profile is incredibly important, that risk-benefit ratio. So we do studies to help overcome these challenges. So there's a lot of different techniques, and what I love about my job is I get to work on so many different methods of doing research. So while the drug is still in development, we do epidemiology to understand the disease state. How many patients actually have this disease we're working on a drug for? Where are some of the unmet needs, and what are the outcomes of current treatments? What's the cost of treating the current illness, and how can the new drug help control some of that? So once a clinical trial is out, and while the FDA is reviewing it, there's about 6 months while the FDA is making their decision. So we look at how our data compares to other trials using literature reviews. And then the part we're really going to focus on today is the economic modeling to support a drug launch. And this really helps the payers and the insurers make a good informed P&T decision. So we make a budget impact model and what we call the AMCP dossier, which you're all going to be very familiar with reading after the P&T committee. So I'm actually one of the people who helped write those for AstraZeneca for my products. I write the whole chapter on the economics output and work with our medical information team to write the rest of the clinical part as well. We also sometimes do cost effectiveness modeling, and we're going to touch a lot on that. And then as the drug's on the market for longer, we do a lot of other studies to help show how the product differentiates from other drugs on the market and how it works in the real world. So a lot of fun tools we have in our toolbox. But at the end of the day, we're all trying to help generate evidence to help doctors make the right clinical decisions for their patients and help insurance companies make the right formulary decisions that we think will deliver the best results for patients. So why should we care about healthcare costs? Well, healthcare costs are incredibly important to our economy, and they've been increasing tremendously. And if you look at this graph from 1960 to 2017, there's been an exponential growth in annual healthcare spending. And right now we're spending almost $4 trillion a year. And that's 20% of our gross domestic product. So if you think about it, one of every $5 spent in the US or generated by our economy is healthcare. And as the population ages, this is going to continue to increase each year. Now, pharmaceutical drugs are a part of that. They haven't increased as rapidly as other healthcare expenditures, but they're still not an insignificant part, 15% or so of healthcare spending. So they're an important aspect, and we really need to, as a society, consider these healthcare costs because the US spends more than any other country on healthcare. And it's not even close. The next closest country, Switzerland, is spending like half of what we do per person. And spending a lot of money on healthcare is fine if we have great outcomes. We are the largest economy in history, and if we spend a lot and we had the best outcomes in the world, that would be fine. But we have worse outcomes in other developed countries, and poorer equity and access, and a lot of challenges with our healthcare system. So controlling the cost of healthcare is incredibly important. And the techniques we're going to talk about today will help payers make those decisions. And from the pharma side, we want to help generate the evidence that payers need to make a decision. And we're creating new drugs, and we think that our drugs bring great value. So we want to communicate that value to payers and to these decision makers. And I said the word value. So what does value mean? What is value in healthcare? So this is the biggest takeaway I remember from my pharmacoeconomics class in pharmacy school. Our professor told us, if you only remember one thing from this class, it's this equation. Value is the outcomes divided by the cost. So basically, what are you getting for every dollar you're spending? And that, at the end of the day, is what value means. For every dollar we spend on healthcare, it's one less dollar that could be spent on building roads and bridges, or one less dollar that could be spent on something else in the economy. So what are we getting for the money we're spending? And that's what economic modeling is going to help us determine. The question is, how do we define outcomes? And this is going to come into play a lot in this presentation. There's a lot of different ways we can think about them. There's clinical outcomes. For example, how many heart attacks do we prevent? How much do we reduce a patient's A1C if they have diabetes? How many patients are alive at 5 years in a cancer study? Then there's economic impacts. For every dollar we spend on a drug, how much are we reducing in hospitalizations? And I just wrote a paper about that today, showing when patients progress in ovarian cancer, their costs increase tremendously. And by putting them on maintenance therapy to prevent progression, you can prevent some of these economic outcomes later. And then there's humanistic outcomes, and these are the ones that really matter to patients a lot of the time. What does the therapy do for a patient's symptoms, their quality of life, their satisfaction with their treatment? So we can think about outcomes in a lot of different ways. And when we get into modeling, that's going to be very important. So I wanted to talk about pharmacoeconomic modeling and these kind of models that we use. So there's two ways we're going to talk about this. So the first one is traditional kind of cost effectiveness methods. And then at the end, I'm going to touch on budget impact models. And depending on the formulary and the P&T committee, they may consider both. Generally, they're going to consider a budget impact more in the US. I'm going to explain what all of this is. I know these all sound like crazy terms. But the original way that people started to think about this cost and model it was with these cost effectiveness analysis. And the US is kind of behind on this methodology. Working for a British company, I get quite a bit of our UK colleagues leading in this area. And I get to see a lot of the great work they do. So the UK is probably the world's leader in cost effectiveness methodology, and their government will not approve a drug unless it's cost effective for payment. And when I'm talking about cost effectiveness analysis, this is the biggest one here. And what we're doing here is thinking back to that equation. We're looking at the cost of the drug in dollars, and then we're looking at the value or the outcomes in terms of natural units related to that. So how many patients' lives were saved, how many events were prevented. So we're looking at it related to the clinical study divided by what you're getting for every dollar of cost. Cost utility analysis is a subset of cost effectiveness analysis. And this is the most commonly used by healthcare decision makers around the world. So the problem is with a cost effectiveness analysis, how do you compare the value of a cancer drug with the value of a drug for psoriasis? The psoriasis study is measured in, it's been so long since I worked on psoriasis, but it's percentage surface area reduction in symptoms. So if a patient has like a 50% reduction in their psoriasis symptoms, and then an oncology study is generally done in months of progression-free survival. So how do I compare the value of that when I'm a formulary in a country trying to make decisions? Which is why about 30, 40 years ago, some economists proposed something called the quality adjusted life year. And we're going to talk a lot about that. But a quality adjusted life year is a method of comparing the value across a whole bunch of different disease states. In fact, you use it for any disease. It's one outcome that can be calculated and allows you to compare the value you're getting for a psoriasis drug with the value you're getting for a cancer drug with the value you're getting for a heart disease drug. And so that's probably the most common used globally. And I'll just touch on these other two here. Cost minimization analysis basically assumes that all the drugs perform the same, and we just look at the cost of treatment in terms of dollars and which treatment minimizes cost. I've done some of these. I think I've only published one of these in my research, but they have their place occasionally. When you have therapies with very similar outcomes, they can be useful just to show which one minimizes cost. And then cost benefit analysis, it basically translates the outcomes into dollars. So this would be saying for every dollar we spend on the drug, we're preventing $100 of healthcare spending later on, something like that. But the main one I want to focus on is this cost utility analysis, and then budget impacts towards the end. So cost utility analysis, we're going to look at the costs in terms of dollars, and then we're going to look at the clinical benefit in terms of quality adjusted life years. And what cost effectiveness does is it helps us determine if a new therapy provides sufficient value compared to the current standard of care. So for most conditions, we have a current drug on the market, and this will help us determine which therapy is a better value. So the measure of outcome we're going to use is called the quality adjusted life year, and I mentioned that on an earlier slide. But what does that actually mean? So the quality adjusted life year is a unique measure because it takes into account the patient's quantity of life and quality of life. So the reason this is important is it allows us to compare a lot of different therapeutics. And I use the example of ovarian cancer and psoriasis because those are different areas I've worked in. Psoriasis drugs, they don't extend your quantity of life at all, but your quality of life improves tremendously because you're no longer itching and you don't have a lot of the terrible side effects of the disease. Now, ovarian cancer drugs, they tend to extend your life quite a bit, but they don't really have a huge impact on the quality of life because oncology drugs have a lot of side effects. So that's an example where it extends your quality of life. And the quality is a cool measure because it allows us to use it for multiple different areas. So the way it works is you multiply the additional life years that a drug gives. So I'm going to use an example from a recent publication I did in ovarian cancer, but my drug extends a patient's life by about 4 years, for 3.5 to 4.5 years. And then you take the number of life years gained and you multiply it by the quality of that life. And this is on a scale of 0 to 1. So 0 is basically you're dead, and 1 is you're in the best health of your life. So you multiply the amount of years gained by the quality of that life, and that gives you how many qualities the drug provides. So it's a simple measure that really provides quite a bit of information. And I won't go into how this quality is calculated here, unless there's questions about it later. But in the slides I sent out, there's like 10 slides explaining how we actually calculate this. There's a lot of different methods to calculate patients' quality of life. And then life years gained are usually taken from the clinical trials. And I didn't include it in this, but one of the big challenges we have when doing these studies and thinking about it is we want to look over a patient's long-term follow-up. But most of the trials are only publishing data for 2 or 3 years. So we create these really complex statistical models that evaluate what we expect to happen over the long range using statistical techniques to estimate what will happen over the rest of the patient's life, how many years will be gained. But that's the basics of equality. So then the next step is, now that we know our outcome, we need to be able to compare the new drug with the current standard of care. So how do we interpret the results that come out of one of these studies? So what's used is called the incremental cost effectiveness ratio. And this is the main measure of interpreting value. So what you're going to do is you're going to divide the cost of the new therapy, or subtract the cost of the new therapy minus the cost of the old therapy, and then divide that by the effectiveness in terms of qualities of the new therapy minus the old therapy. So drug A is the current standard of care. And then drug B is the new one that you want a formulary decision maker to select for their formulary. So you're going to say for every additional dollar, that's what this equation is really giving you. For every additional dollar we spend on drug B over the cost of drug A, here's the additional benefit we get. And that's just what the incremental cost effectiveness ratio is at the end of the day. How much it costs for every additional unit of benefit in terms of quality adjusted life years. So this is saying for every additional quality of life year the drug gives you over what the traditional standard of care, this is how much extra it'll cost. And then what we do is we plot it on a grid here. And at the center of this grid is 0. And basically that's the current intervention. And then we need to think, is the drug delivering more qualies or less? So that's what the x-axis here is. So if a drug is delivering more qualies, we move to the right, and most new drugs will deliver more clinical outcomes. Otherwise, the FDA is not going to approve them if they're worse than the standard of care. So you're almost always going to be in the top right here. Now the question is, how does this therapy stack up in terms of cost? And now if the new therapy is cheaper than the standard of care, you're in this bottom here, and there is no question that the formulary decision maker should pay for it. You're getting better outcomes for less money. It's a no-brainer. Every formulary decision maker in the world would say, absolutely, let's go with it. Put it on the formulary today. But where most drugs lie here is in the top right. So the drug is more effective, but it's also more costly. And now here's where we need to think about, is what we're getting, the extra value on the x-axis, worth the extra cost on the y-axis? And the incremental cost effectiveness ratio, if you're into math, is the slope of the line. If you were to plot the point here, it's the slope of the line from 0 to that. You don't need to know that, but if you're into the math of it, that's what this equation really tells you. But basically, most drugs are going to be more effective, but also more costly. And our job as formulary decision makers in this competition is to determine, is the extra value you're getting worth the extra cost? So what cost per quality, additional quality, is considered cost effective and is worth it? And the answer is it really differs by each country, each payer, and each situation. So I mentioned that the UK is the leading expert in the world, and the UK has very stringent rules where it's a yes/no decision for a therapy. If a drug is 20 to 30,000 pounds per year cost per each additional quality, it's considered cost effective and they'll pay for it. If it's higher, you either have to reduce your price or they're not paying for it. And there are some exceptions for end-of-life situations like cancer treatments where this is like a fourth-line treatment and the patients have no other option. They allow a little higher cost. And then for extraordinarily rare conditions, they allow you to go up as high as 100,000 because they know that there needs to be an economic incentive to develop the drugs. And the US is a lot less stringent. Most payers in the US consider $100,000 to $150,000 per quality adjusted life year to be cost effective. So basically we're saying if the additional cost you're getting for each quality adjusted life year is less than 100 to 150,000, it's a pretty cost effective option. And once you've done that, there's a question you need to think about. This is a model. And one of my favorite comments from economists, there's an old British economist who said, all models are wrong, some are useful. Because you have to make a lot of assumptions to make one of these models. And at the end of the day, it's a model of a disease state. And the economist Paul Krugman basically described models as they're a framework and a metaphor to think about the decision. So you have to make a lot of assumptions of how many patients will get the drug, what their average patient's duration of treatment is. And so there's a lot of different things that can impact the results. So when companies put out these results, they give you the number, their estimate, and that's called basically the base case. So I might say my drug has a cost per quality adjusted life year of $50,000. And that's kind of the base case. That's my best guess estimate. But I also want to show that the model I made is very robust and very rich in data. So what we do is sensitivity analysis, we call it. And you may see some of this when you look at the AMCP dossier to make the decision. So one-way sensitivity analysis, or sometimes called deterministic sensitivity analysis, is where you vary single things in the model. So you vary these models are extraordinarily complicated and they have a lot of variables, sometimes hundreds. But with the one-way sensitivity, you basically vary a few of the ones you think are the most important. And then it tells you how the model results change based on the small changes you made. And then you can produce what's called the tornado diagram. And you may see this in some of the AMCP dossiers. I'm not sure if the drug you're reviewing has it in there, but it basically says the factor at the top is the one that impacts the model the most, and then it goes down to the smallest impact. And this basically gives you an estimate of what variables change the model the most. So it may be average patient age. One of them might be it's usually cost of the drug is the one that varies it the most. So this gives you a sense of how good the model is. If it varies a lot, then the model has a lot of questionable assumptions. But then the other thing we want to do is vary all of the factors at the same time, because this is changing one factor at a time. So here, probabilistic sensitivity analysis varies all the factors in the model at the same time. And this can't be done by hand. It would take you a year to do this by hand. But luckily, with the advances in computing technology we have in the last 10 or 20 years, we can run 10,000 versions of the model in under a minute. And what this does is you have a distribution, a statistical distribution, and it randomly selects each variable from the distribution. So if you have 100 variables in your model, it'll select from your statistical distribution each variable randomly and then run the model. And each of these dots is the cost per quality for one of those simulations. And what this does is it allows you to get a 95% confidence interval around your estimate. And it tells you how robust it is. And you can run 100,000 incredibly quickly. And this is my favorite thing to see in a model, because if almost all of these points are less than 100,000 per cost per quality, you know the model is really strong and there's a high probability. So I know this may seem confusing. I'm happy to take questions at the end, but this looks like a lot of dots, but here we plot it on a graph, and you may see this reported in a lot of these models. So what it does is it shows, we talked about willingness to pay before. So in the US, most plans are willing to pay 100,000 per quality adjusted life year. So what this graph is telling you is what percentage of these dots fall below that willingness to pay threshold. So the first time I saw it, took me a year to figure out how to interpret these, but I think I have a good explanation. So what this is basically saying is your blue line here is your new drug. And this is from an actual publication I did for my drug. So I work on a drug called olaparib for ovarian cancer, and we're in combination with bevacizumab in this population. And our comparator was bevacizumab on its own. So if a plan is willing to pay 100,000 per quality adjusted life year, 88% of our scenarios we ran fell below that. So there's an 88% chance that it's cost effective if they're willing to pay 100,000. If a plan is willing to pay a little more, 150,000, there's a 98.6% chance that the drug is cost effective. And then the orange line is just the competitor product. It's basically the inverse of, but the one you should focus on is the new drug. And the other one is just showing you the inverse. And the reason you have it is for this point here, it just shows you at what point the drugs are interchangeable. So this basically says if a plan is only willing to pay like $75,000 per quality a year in the US, the drugs are basically interchangeable and they could pick either. So then they would need to consider the safety or whatever else. But as you get past this point, the new drug becomes a much better value, and there's a very high probability that it's cost effective. So this basically takes all of these points and then just plots what percentage fall below a certain amount. So this basically says 88% fall below the 100,000 per quality, and this says that almost all of them fall below the 150,000 per quality. So I know this sounds like a lot, and I have a lot more resources included in the backup slides if any of you are interested. And we'll have plenty of time for question and answer at the end. And then I just wanted to talk about budget impact models next. And this is probably what you're going to see the most and what US payers like the most. Cost effectiveness, generally, you may see it in the competition, it's good to know, but budget impact models are what most US payers think about. And I'll give you an explanation of the reason why. Cost effectiveness models consider value over a lifetime often, or over a long term. And sometimes it takes a long term to see those outcomes or values. But the problem in the US is we're not one health insurer. There's hundreds, thousands of insurance companies in the US. And on average, patients are switching their insurance plan every 2 or 3 years. So an insurance plan says, yeah, that's all well and good that, the long term, you're going to save this much or the patient's going to have these outcomes. That's another insurance company's problem. I need to know, I don't care what the outcomes are. I need to know this new drug, what are we getting and how much is this going to cost us in the next 1 to 5 years when the patient is my problem? And it's kind of a narrow way of thinking, but from a business perspective, it makes sense for the insurance companies to often think this way. They need to think about in the short term, how much are we spending? And I'll give you an example of why budget impact models are important. So a lot of you know about the Hep C drugs, Cefaldi and all those. They have an incredible cost per quality. It's a tremendous value, even at the high price. You're getting great outcomes. But the problem is there's a lot of patients with Hep C in the US, and it's $86,000 upfront. So if an insurance company had to pay that for every single one of their people with Hep C, that's a tremendous cost for them. And the same thing with the PCSK9s for cholesterol. It's a great value, but at the same time, there's a lot of people and a high initial cost. So that's where the budget impact model comes in. And basically what the budget impact model does is it tells the insurance company 2 things. How many people do we think are going to be eligible for this drug in their plan? And then how much is it going to cost them? So what you do is, and this is the most simple financial model for a plan. And we build a kind of a generic model, and then we have field teams that actually go out to different insurance companies and work through the data with them. And they enter this, so it's basically built in Microsoft Excel generally. And it allows the plan to enter the size of their insurance company, and then it'll print out how many patients we think will be eligible. So what you're doing is you're figuring out how many patients you think will have the drug. So you need to first figure out the size of the insurance company. And generally when we make the generic model, we'll use like 1 million people, because that's the size of many of the big insurance plans. So then you apply the incidence and prevalence. So now this is starting to make sense why I do epidemiology research while the drug is in development. It's to inform the creation of these models. How many patients do we actually think have this disease? And you think that these statistics are out there, but surprisingly with a lot of the statistics on epidemiology of diseases, they're very old and out of date because there's not a lot of economic incentive other than a pharmaceutical company to actually do the research. So a lot of the time we don't know the incidence or prevalence until I go out and do the study to figure out how many patients actually have a specific rare cancer. So the first thing you need to know from the total population of the insurance company, how many people actually have this disease? And then of those, what percentage of them are actually diagnosed and treated? Sometimes the physicians may not test all the patients, or they may not treat everyone, or patients may not want treatment. So we need to estimate what percentage actually get a treatment. And then what you need to do is figure out what are the current ways they're being treated right now, and how much does that cost? And then once this new drug comes on the market, how much will it cost the healthcare system? And the difference is the budget impact. So you're basically saying, say that there's 50 ovarian cancer patients, and this is my area. That's pretty high. Say a plan has 20 ovarian cancer patients, or 20 or 30 ovarian cancer patients. We would look at how are they currently treated. And with that example I gave earlier, many of them may get bevacizumab today. And so then we do literature searches, and we use some of that economic research we did to understand what's the cost of their hospitalizations, their diagnostic tests, their drugs, their doctor visits. And then we estimate when our drug comes on the market, how much will it increase that? And this is a really interesting area. There's the upfront cost of the drugs, but you also need to consider how it impacts other things. So the drug may have a really high upfront cost, but what I showed with my therapy, for example, is the drug has cost, but it prevents later surgeries and later oncologist visits because the patient doesn't have the cancer recur. So you have to consider the upfront cost of the drug and then what kind of savings the plan will see in the next 5 years. So basically, it's telling the insurance company how much more do they expect to spend if they put this drug on their formulary and give access to all the patients. And so this, while you're working on your budget impact model and considering this for the P&T competition, I highly recommend checking out this particular reference at the bottom here. ISPOR, the club I mentioned earlier, they're not just a pharmacy school club. They actually have quite a large presence throughout the world. And what they do is they put out guidance on what makes a good model. So a few years ago, this is almost 10 years old at this point, but it's still the gold standard. So they got economists from all over the world. And I was looking at the paper last night. There were people from Poland on it, Argentina, the UK, the US. So economists from all over the world got together and they put together guidelines of what makes a good budget impact model. And so when you're reviewing the model in the P&T competition, I would check out this criteria here. And this will help you determine if they did a good quality model. And how do we interpret the results? So I talked a lot about what is in this model. And here's the actual output. This is not from one of my models. This is from a different recently published model. But there's two things you want to think about. It's the per member per month and per patient per month. So the insurance company, they treat millions of people. They want to know for every member, how much is this going to cost? So what you do is you divide the total number of, or the total amount of cost for the treatments, and then you divide it by the size of the plan. And this basically gives them a good sense of how much it's going to cost and allows them to compare different treatments. And I talked with my boss about this today. I actually asked him, is there a guideline for what is considered an acceptable per member per month? And he said that it's very vague, but generally less than like 10 cents per member per month. So if you have $1 million plan, 10 cents of their monthly premiums, less than that is considered acceptable for a new drug. But there's no official guidance on that, like there is with cost effectiveness analysis. And it really depends on the plan. And then per patient is divided by the number of patients. And so most of the results for these treatments are a small increase in per member per month of a few cents, 3 to 5 to sometimes up to 10 cents. But if a lot of patients on the plan were getting a new, very expensive drug, that could be very high. And what this basically is showing here is a great example. So this is in thyroid cancer. But basically you're looking at this model. So the first thing to look at is the epidemiology. So this model in thyroid cancer, and this is not one I made, but I thought it was a really nice example. So it showed that they predict that in year 1, 2 patients will be treated, and then going up to almost 4 patients by the 3rd year. And basically what this is saying is they think that screening will improve and you'll find more patients. So you have to account for that. But basically they're saying less than 5 patients in this plan are actually going to be treated with this disease. And then here's how much the new drug will cost. And so this is the world with the new drug. And this is the world if the new drug was not approved. So the new drug, this is how much it'll cost for the drug. This is how much it will cost for administering the drug. If it's an IV drug, you have to think about that. A nurse or a technician has to actually inject it. How much will it cost to monitor the patient, their doctor's visits and follow-up? How much will adverse events cost for the drug? And then how much will other factors like testing for the drug or any kind of biomarker test that needs to go along with it? And this gives you, basically for these 2 patients, it's going to cost the insurance company $391,000 if the new drug's approved. And then they did if the new drug wasn't approved. And this model is cool because they found that there's actually cost savings from improving the new drug. And that's very rare. Usually there's a higher cost. But this is an example where there's actually cost savings. And you're reducing the cost of the drug as well as some of the testing and other costs. And then down here is basically subtracting the 2. So they're basically saying the new drug will save the plan $3,000 in drug costs. It'll save the plan, same administration costs, it'll save a little bit of monitoring costs, but the adverse event costs will be a little bit higher. And here's how the total impact in terms of budget. The plan can expect $3,000 less cost. Usually it'll be higher here. And then when you divide by the million people in the plan, basically it has no impact to their budget, they're saying, or a slightly reduced budget per member per month. Generally, this will be a positive impact. The new drug may cost the plan $500,000 if they cover it, and this is how much it'll cost per member per month. And this is generally what formulary committees use. Some will look at an increasingly cost effectiveness results, the cost per quality adjusted life year. But generally, they'll look at the clinical outcomes in the trial. They'll say, okay, this new drug seems to be more effective, and it has a relatively small budget impact. Let's put it on the formulary. But then they need to decide, how do we put it on the formulary, which is a perfect segue to our next information session here. How do they actually use this data to make a decision? So there's a lot of funds flowing through the pharmaceutical industry and the pharmaceutical supply chain. And this is important to know. I won't go too much into this, but a lot of different people are at play. And the health plan is not directly linked to the manufacturer, but the health plan at the end of the day is the one paying things. So generally your employer gives your premiums to your health plan, and then the health plan often works with a pharmacy benefit manager, and the PBM is often the one that does the formulary decision making. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to have this on here, is some health insurance companies do it themselves, and some have a third-party company called the pharmacy benefit manager that actually does the P&T decision. But basically, they look at the data from the manufacturer and then make a decision of how to place it on the formulary. And then oftentimes manufacturers give, basically they'll give discounts off the list price of the drug to help. Sometimes the plan will say, this drug's a little too expensive, it's gonna have a big budget impact, can you give us some rebates, some discounts? And they'll negotiate an agreement with each pharmaceutical company This is generally done more in primary care where there's a lot of competition, like diabetes, heart disease. There's 100 diabetes drugs out there, or 100 drugs for high cholesterol or high blood pressure. So there's a lot more discounts and rebates. But in where the space where I work in oncology, where there's not a lot of treatments and there's a high unmet need, there isn't as much of these business to business discussions with rebates and all. But basically, this is where in the process the formulary decision happens. And I won't go too much on this slide, but it's basically just showing who gets a cut of all the dollars spent in healthcare. And each of the people in the supply, the only thing I want you to take away from this is each of the people in the supply chain gets a cut of the money. So for every $100 spent on a drug, the manufacturer gets some, but everyone takes a profit. The wholesaler, the pharmacy benefit manager, the insurance company. And that's one of the reasons our healthcare system in the US is so inefficient, is because there's so many people involved in this decision and they all profit off of it. So at the end of the day, of the $100 spent, only $15 of it or less are actually profit to the pharmaceutical company. And almost as much profit goes to the other people in the supply chain who didn't invent the drug. But they're also very important parts of the supply chain because they make sure it gets to the patient's counseled, and that the right formulary decision is made to manage the costs. So on that topic, I know we're running a little low on time and I want to leave time for questions. What are the goals of the insurance company? So basically, they want to make sure that they're getting and delivering the best healthcare for the money they have available. So the key principle of economics in the first day of every economics class is resources are scarce, so how do we allocate them? So I would love that the insurance companies spend all their money on ovarian cancer because that's my focus area. But insurance companies need to treat diabetes patients, ovarian cancer patients, heart disease patients, Hep C patients, COVID patients these days. So the insurance company needs to make sure that they can cover all of these patients with the amount of premiums and amount of money they have and get the best outcomes. So they have a lot of different techniques, rebates that we talked about, coordinating care, making sure that patients are taking the drugs they're paying for, working with pharmacies to make sure that patients actually pick up the drug, managing utilization formularies to make sure that they're getting value and that this is not wasteful and that ineligible patients aren't taking it. For example, doctors are not using it for crazy off-label indications that have no evidence to support it, things like that. And then co-pays, co-insurance are the ways that they help share the risk. I won't get into the economic theory of co-pays and co-insurance, but basically the formulary committee needs to think about the clinical data, which as pharmacists, what's that risk-benefit profile? And then they need to think about the economic benefit. And this is where the data I provide comes in. We provide for the clinical information in the AMCP dossier, what's in the trials, what's in the preclinical, what's in the pharmacology reports. We just provide all the information, hundreds of pages of documents. And then the pharmacists and MDs at the plan will review that from a clinical perspective and decide if it's a sufficient risk-benefit ratio. But then they also need to think about the economics of it. And that's where all the modeling we just talked about. And then what they do is they make their formulary decision. And their goals are eliminate unsafe or expensive use that delivers no benefit over the current standard or cheaper alternatives. They want to increase their negotiating power. So by having these formulary processes, it allows the payers to negotiate with pharmaceutical companies and say, hey, if this drug is not on a great tier, not a lot of patients will take it. But if you're able to give us discounts or reduce the cost, then we can give you a little bit better positioning on the tiers, and everyone the patient benefits from getting your drug. So it allows them to have a little bit of negotiating power to reduce their costs so that they can spend those costs on treating other conditions. So the insurance companies is trying to get the best outcomes for all of their patients. And the pharmaceutical companies are focused on selling what they think is a good product for a specific subgroup of patients. But the insurance company needs to weigh all the data and the purchasing of all the drugs across all different therapeutic areas. So we basically give them a pitch for the value of my product is this. We know you have a lot of different things you need to consider with your formulary and all the patients. So here's all the data, and it'll help you make a decision of what's right for your patient population. And it promotes the use of high value drugs. So some drugs provide a tremendous value. For every dollar you're spending, you're getting really great outcomes. So the formulary process allows them to kind of promote the use of the high value therapies. And then I'll go through this very quickly. There's different ways formulary decision makers can manage things. And one thing is with tiers that I mentioned. So they may have different cost sharing for the patients. So oftentimes you'll have a preferred generic and a non-preferred generic. So they'll look at the data and say, patients will only have to pay $10 for what we think is the best value generic. And then if they want a different one, or the physician wants to prescribe a different one, they'll be a little bit higher cost. So generally, where the area I work is in specialty, where the patients have to pay a percentage of the cost. And a lot of the drugs you'll see in the P&T competitions are new specialty products. That's where a lot of drug development is right now. So you have to decide if this is going to be a preferred specialty drug with low cost. If it's a high value drug that delivers a lot for the patients, you may want to position it as a preferred drug. You want physicians to prescribe that and get as many patients on the preferred one as possible. And then you might have a little bit higher cost sharing to discourage use of the non-preferred or drugs that you think are lower value. And then you can also do things like have prior authorization criteria. And the idea is to make sure that the right patient is getting the drugs. So generally in where I work in oncology, the prior authorization criteria are driven by the label and what the specific subgroup. So my product, the prior authorization criteria might say, patient needs to have evidence of this specific biomarker test results, and then we'll pay for it. Quantity limits are often done, not as often in oncology, but in other areas. An example being opioids. Insurance companies will only pay for 10 at a time, maybe. And they don't want to pay, for example, if the insurance company pays for a 90 or a longer day's supply, and then the patient takes 2 of the drug and has side effects and then doesn't take the rest, that's money wasted because they need to be on another treatment now. And the insurance company just paid for 90 of a drug, 90-day supply, and the patient's only taking it for 2 days. So they want to start off limiting to small sample size, small quantities, and they can use that. And then the last method that insurance companies have are step therapies, where they'll cover a drug, but only after a patient has failed 1 treatment. So an example here, and this was some slides that one of my friends, a managed care made and gave me, is in diabetes, they might require you to try metformin, which is cheaper than dirt at this point. You can get metformin for like a penny, and it's pretty good. So the insurance company, and diabetes is not a condition that will kill you overnight, type 2. So they say, hey, try metformin, and if your A1C doesn't get under control, and your doctor shows us that through prior authorization, we'll cover a second or a third line therapy, like a GPL-1 or one of those kind of things, or that are more expensive. So these are some of the methods. And the reason I'm mentioning this is when you make your formulary decision for the P&T competition, you definitely want to consider these options. Are you going to control cost using a tier, prior authorization, quantity limits, step therapy? So these are all the tools that you can apply. And I know I've been talking quite a bit, so I am very happy to take any questions that you guys may have. And if you don't have any now, feel free to email me. I'm happy to answer any and do that as well. And any questions?
I know I can read one off that someone put into the chat.
Sure.
I'm not sure who it is because it looks like they called in maybe by phone. But
Mhm.
so given your experience analyzing healthcare systems in the US and the UK, what recommendations would you give to better the American system? And they just commented and said, it's a shame that the US spends the most on healthcare, yet our health outcomes are lacking compared to other developed nations. And is there something that can be improved in the US, like in the way that we approach managed care?
Those are excellent, excellent questions. And there's a few things I see. The first one is we need to get everyone access to some kind of insurance. And there's different ways. People have proposed Medicare for all. There's issues and drawbacks with that from an economic perspective, but there's tremendous benefits. But we need some method of getting everyone insurance. That's the first step. And the reason I'm saying this is because the way our healthcare financing in the US is set up, the prices are assuming everyone has insurance, but not everyone has insurance. So we need to make sure that everyone has some kind of coverage. That's the first step. Whether we do it through commercial insurers, the government, there's benefits and drawbacks to each. I have my own plans for how I would revise the US economy and healthcare system. I call it Medicare Advantage for all, where I would have all basically employers, Medicare, Medicaid, all purchased from the same pool of private insurance companies like Medicare Advantage does. And if you are low income, the government would pay for your insurance. If you're working, your employer would pay. And if you're older, the government would pay. But it's all purchasing the same plans. It's just changing who pays for it. And the plans would be commercially run. That's my philosophy of how I would do it, but there's a lot of different methods. But regardless of how you do it, first step is we need to get everyone covered. And the big reason around that is preventative care. And one of the reasons the US healthcare system is so inefficient is because a lot of the cost goes to treating patients who already have developed the conditions. And this is something that the Obama administration made tremendous strides on, coverage for preventative care. So if you've noticed in the last couple of years, preventative care generally has zero copays, and that was part of the Affordable Care Act. Things like your routine doctor visits and routine screenings, things like that, often are covered with no copay. So we need to do more of that and make sure that patients are getting therapies based on or trying to get more preventative versus treatment. That's the biggest step. And then the last part is cost. How do we control the cost of these new therapies that are increasing? And cost will generally increase over time as the quality of the healthcare we're getting today is much more than it was in the 1960s. If you had cancer in the 1960s, they basically tried to cut it out, gave you some really, really rudimentary chemotherapy, and sent you on your way. It was cheap, but the outcomes were not great. Today, we are at the point where we're almost curing some cancers, especially some of the hematologic cancers. And it's expensive, but you're getting a lot more value. So costs will always increase over time. And it's just making sure that the value we're getting is worth that investment and slowing the rise in cost. And then the last part is just making sure that patients can afford the drugs and outpatient or their copays. So those are the ways I see it. And then final step is we need to streamline the process of the healthcare delivery and the payment. And one of the reasons the US is so inefficient is in drug costs, everybody is getting a piece of the pie. So the pharmaceutical companies get a lot of the blame for the high cost of healthcare and the high cost of drugs. But they're only a part of the puzzle. And there's things that the pharmaceutical industries can definitely do to keep costs down for patients. But there's also costs and overhead from each part of the supply chain. So it's streamlining the drug supply chain, and not just with drugs, but other medical devices and other parts of the delivery process. So that being said, there's a lot of things we can do. Getting people insured, preventative care, streamlining the delivery process, and making sure that people have access to affordable coverage, and that the price that patients pay does not discourage them from getting primary care and getting treatment early. So those are the things the steps I think are most critical for reforming the healthcare system.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any other questions that they'd like to ask at this time? I do agree with, like you said, Dan, if you want to drop your email in the chat, if you don't mind having
Oh,
Steve
sure.
reach
And
out
I
as
think
well.
I think I sent the slides too. I don't know if they got distributed to everyone. I sent them to Fadi earlier today.
Okay,
But let me put my how do I access this chat?
might be under like more.
There we go.
Yeah.
Okay, will it allow me to paste? Let me try this again. Okay. Oh, whoops, I forgot the .com. Let me try that again. Yeah, I'm happy to, and if you guys didn't receive these slides, feel free to email me and I can always resend them to you guys. Because there's a lot more I didn't cover today. There's about 20 or 30 slides I didn't cover that have more information if any of you are really interested in this area, seeing how we actually make one of these models and different aspects and a lot more of the technical side of things. But yeah, any other questions I can answer for you guys?
No, it doesn't look like it, I guess, at this time. So if anybody does have any questions, I know I'll be following up with you personally via email. And then I'll make sure that the slide set does get out as well to everybody here today. So we definitely want to thank you for your time, for coming in and sharing your expertise today. It's really appreciated.
Absolutely. I'm happy to do it. I love talking about this, and you can probably tell I'm really passionate about this and healthcare delivery and economics in general, and happy to do this anytime.
Well, yeah, that's great. We appreciate the openness and availability. And then before we go ahead and wrap up, I just had a couple quick announcements to make to the members who are here. For those who are in the P&T competition, just so you know where you should be at this point in time. So you should have some sort of like open form of communication that you've established among your team members. And you should definitely have an appointed team lead by now. If you've not yet met with your advisor, please send an email to schedule that as soon as possible. You don't want your team to fall behind in the process. I know that this can get pretty involved as we move forward, so we definitely want to stay on top of everything. So yeah, at this juncture, you should really be working to delegate your tasks and establish timelines to gather all your basic information. And then as a reminder for those who have not done it yet, you need to register with the e-dossier. I have like a PDF that lets you know how. I can drop it in the chat, or I'll send it in an email later, but that is where you're going to get all of your updates and information regarding P&T. So very important that you register with that. And then, yeah, I guess that's really it. Our next general meeting is supposed to fall the day before the holiday. So I'm just going to be sending out likely a recorded video rather than holding an actual meeting, so that way everyone can enjoy their holiday break. Did we have any other questions or comments before we close for the day? No? Okay. Well, thank you again for your time, and thank you for those who came. I was really appreciated again, and it was a pleasure to work with you today, Dan.
Definitely, and good luck with the competition. It's a great experience, and it'll look great on all your CVs. So have a great rest of the year, and good luck with it. Bye.
Yeah. Thanks. Bye.